Well, hello and welcome to the second of 5 Google Hangouts as part of the USS Colorado experience and also the Colorado History's Greatest Hits series. And if it looks like or seems like I'm reading, it's because I am. I want to make sure I don't miss any points. This is intentional. These Hangouts are also supported by MSU Denver. We have some faculty here presenting from Metro State, also TPS at MSU Denver, the Denver Post Educational Services, History Colorado, and also the USS Colorado Commissioning Committee. We're building context leading up to a teacher workshop, which will happen on July 28th at History Colorado, and ultimately leading up to the commissioning of the USS Colorado, which is the 15th Virginia class naval submarine. My name is Taylor Kendall, Project Coordinator for the Teaching with Primary Sources program at MSU Denver. Today we're also joined by Derek Everett, Professor of History at MSU Denver, as well as a colleague of his, Dr. Todd Laugen, also Professor of History at MSU Denver. So thank you both for joining. If you're viewing through Google+, feel free, and we encourage you to use the Q&A app to ask any questions. And we'll also utilize the Showcase app to provide any links that we need to. So with that, I think I'll turn it. Well, actually, we have a little plug for a book that Todd's going to do, but then I'll turn it over to Derek to find out just how Colorado got its shape. So Todd.
Thanks, Taylor. I just wanted to quickly note that our guest speaker today, our expert, just published a book, Creating the American West. It's a great title for a book. He got there first with that title, which is an interesting look at how different Western states took the shapes that they did and explores in very interesting and engaging ways the controversies that unfolded as Western states, starting with even the Louisiana Purchase and the states carved out of that area got their name. So let's hear from Derek.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. I appreciate the note for my book, and it's a wonderful experience to be here. This is the first Google performance that I've done. I've never done an online camera before, so I'm learning it. I feel like I'm all set up like my air traffic controller mode here. So if there's a delay at DIA today, we'll know exactly why that is. I love the project that we have going on as well, and the blend between some diverse aspects of Colorado history and the commissioning of the USS Colorado, and following in a noble tradition of a number of ships that have taken that name as well. And today what I'm here to present about is the physical shape of the state. How is it that we got to be where we are? And let me bring up, seeing if I can bring that up there. Okay. A map of the state of Colorado, simple, basic, dignified, decent rectangle. You know, could it be any simpler? Could it be any more perfect? The state of Colorado that we essentially take for granted today is a very complicated, has a very complicated origin story to it. And it very much belies the simple, basic rectangle that we see when we look at the map. When you see the state of Colorado, you have to remember that when, even up through the gold rush, when everybody's coming out in 1858, 59, and the excitement in our area in Denver up to Central City, Idaho Springs area, Colorado did not exist. There was no such place as Colorado on the map. And the creation of Colorado was a direct result of the gold rush. There are so many people, tens of thousands of people, moving to this region at the end of the 1850s that they needed local government. They needed ways to protect their land claims, whether they're miners or farmers. They wanted the basic structures of law and order, court systems and judges. And what's now Colorado was divided up among 4 territories. On the western slope, essentially everything west of the Continental Divide was Utah Territory, based out of Salt Lake City. To the eastern plains, you had sort of the northeast east corner of the state was part of the Nebraska Territory that covered not only what's now the state of Nebraska, but went all the way up to Canada and all the way over to the Continental Divide. If you're familiar with Baseline Road in Boulder, Baseline sits on the 40th parallel of north latitude, and that's also the state boundary between Nebraska and Kansas itself. You can see the edge of the gray line there on the right side of the screen. So Nebraska was theoretically in control of everything north of Baseline Road in Boulder. South of that was Kansas Territory, which extended not only over what's now the state of Kansas, but also through the Denver area all the way up to the Divide. And New Mexico Territory was in charge of the southeastern portion, the San Luis Valley, Trinidad area, south of the Arkansas River as well. So there's 4 different territories, none of which really controlled the region, none of which really had the authority or the wherewithal to manage it. Remember, there's no railroads out here, there's no telegraph out here. It takes maybe 2 months to get to Denver from the Missouri River, and that's going to make communication, that's going to make transportation, government, the management of this population, it's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So there is this sense that you've gone out to strike it rich, but there's no protection for your land claims, whether you're a farmer, you're a miner. You feel as if you're cut off. And let's face it, the governments in Nebraska and Kansas especially, they didn't really want to be bothered with this large, complicated, often obnoxious group far, far to the west, and 500 miles away from where Omaha, the base of Nebraska at the time, or the various capitals of Kansas Territory, it's just far too far away. And so there is this demand, this desire for a local government, a territory. Every western state starts out as a territory. 2 exceptions, California and Texas, but we don't talk about California and Texas. We don't care if they have ships named after them. This is Colorado. So with this transitional government, a need for this government, a territory, think of it like being a teenager. And maybe this will help to explain to your students how Colorado changes, how it evolves. It goes from not existing at all, being divided up among these 4 different territories, to being a territory itself. The Territory of Colorado was declared in 1861, February of 1861. And part of the management of a territory was that you have a local legislature. The people who live in that territory will vote for people who make the basic fundamental laws. It's not polite to kill people or take their land or whatever. But governors, judges, all of the officials that managed the territory were appointed by the federal government. So it's like being a teenager. You're starting to learn how to run your own affairs. You're starting to learn how to manage what you need, what you want. But somebody has veto power over you. Somebody is able to decide whether what you want is a good thing for you, or in this case for the country, for the region. And so being a territory, there's some frustration, as there is in being a teenager, but it's that essential step toward becoming a state. Once the institutions you have, political, legal institutions you've created, once they're seen as stable, once they're seen as capable of governing themselves, then you could apply to become a state. Congress would pass a bill that gives you essentially a permission slip to write a constitution, to organize yourself. Once you've written a constitution and the voters in the territory approved it, then it would go off to Washington, D.C. And if Congress and the President said, yes, this looks like a good government, it fits with the other states, they don't have weird state symbols yet, we're not going to worry about our state reptile for a few years. Once you have all of that stuff you actually need to operate yourself, you get to join the Union as a full state, at least theoretically equal with New York and California and Pennsylvania and the bigger, the more established ones. Now, making Colorado a territory, transitioning it from those 4 different far-flung pieces of other territories into its own, was complicated by the fact that the gold rush takes place within a few years of the Civil War. And let's face it, Washington, D.C. wasn't nearly as concerned about what's going on in western Kansas Territory as they were in what was happening in Virginia or in South Carolina. So the idea of armed rebellion, of John Brown's rebellion at Harper's Ferry, of the Dred Scott decision, that's sucking all of the attention away from the gold mining area. And the miners tried to create their own territory since Congress wasn't paying attention to them, didn't grant them their own. So you have a sense that, let me come back here to myself here. Okay, you have the sense that nobody's paying attention to us. Nobody's listening to what we need, to what we want in Washington, D.C. So let's make our own. There was an attempt in October of 1859 to create what was called the Territory of Jefferson, and that covered essentially all of what's now Colorado, about the southern half of Wyoming, the Nebraska Panhandle, portion of Utah. Nobody actually controlled all of that territory. It was, kids in their clubhouse saying, this forest is ours. Well, you're in charge of your clubhouse, and that's about it. But it was a good sign of the frustration, the need that people had for that local government. And once states started to secede in December of 1860 and early 1861, the federal government recognized that the Civil War is headed this way. There's this tension that we have to address, and we don't want problems in the West to distract us from dealing with the problems in the South. So there was finally this motivation to grant territorial status to the cranky gold miners in the Rocky Mountains. So we became a territory on February 28th, 1861. And to go back to the map again for just a second, the boundaries that Colorado received, here we go, the boundaries that Colorado received, and this was rare for a lot of Western territories, the shape that we had in February of 1861 is the same shape that we have today. Most Western territories change their shape, usually shrink with the creation of new ones like Colorado, but we were perfect from the very beginning. There's no reason to improve. We've got this glorious rectangle. And the boundaries themselves were chosen as a practical thing as much as anything else. Nobody really knew the geography, the landscape, the cultures of the area. All that was known in 1861 is we need this place to be stable so that it doesn't cause us problems while we're trying to deal with the problems of the Civil War. And so we're just going to plunk 4 geometric boundaries down that will provide some structure, some organization. The 2 boundaries north and south are both parallels of latitude. The southern boundary is 37 degrees north, and the northern boundary is 41 degrees north. The eastern and western boundaries, though, are interesting. Pardon me. And the eastern and western boundaries are lines of longitude, but they're not lines of Greenwich longitude, the one that's based out of the observatory outside of London. And when you think of the Greenwich meridians and the 180 degrees west, 180 degrees east around the planet. In 1850, 11 years before Colorado became a territory, the United States wanted to show that we were independent, that we didn't need to depend on any other country for our longitude, so we created our own. And based out of the Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., which is roughly where the Kennedy Center, the State Department is today, that's where the Naval Observatory was then, the federal government created what were called the American Prime Meridian, a line that went right through that Naval Observatory that you needed to measure, just as the Greenwich meridians go through the Greenwich Observatory in England. And the boundaries of Colorado east and west are called lines west of Washington. So they're lines of longitude, just not the lines of longitude most people are familiar with. The eastern line is the 25th degree west of Washington, and the western line is the 32nd degree. west of Washington, and that difference isn't much. It's only about 2 or 3 miles between Washington meridians and Greenwich meridians. The lines almost meet up, but not quite. Every once in a while this comes into play. The Denver Post will publish an article that someone's gone down to Four Corners with their GPS, and as a matter of fact, hey, Four Corners, there we go. Somebody's gone down to the Four Corners Monument, where Colorado meets up with Arizona and Utah and New Mexico, and they've placed it there at the corner, and it's not on 109 degrees west. It's off. It's wrong, and so we must move the monument. Well, it's not supposed to be on 109 degrees west. It's supposed to be on 32 degrees west of Washington, which it is, and so the monument's exactly where it's supposed to be. It's just confusing if you don't know that there's different kinds of latitude and longitude. So the boundaries that we have, the boundaries that we recognize today, emerged out of a sense of American patriotism. We want our own lines of latitude, our own lines of longitude. When the boundaries are declared in 1861, that's just the first step. They exist in theory in 1861, but they don't necessarily exist in practice. Nobody's gone out and surveyed them, marked them to show exactly where the glory that is Colorado ends and the despair that is, I don't know, one of our neighbors begins. So there are a series of surveys that are done within a few years of 1861. Survey teams that follow each of the 4 lines and set up official U.S. government survey markers. Sometimes they're just like a pile of rocks here and there, and they'll eventually be made more formal as the years go by. There'll be formal survey posts that are put in. The last of the surveys was completed in 1879, and it was the northwest corner of the state, the most remote, the hardest to reach of all of them, up in the corner toward Moffat County. And that was the last one that was done, in part because it's the hardest to get to, the most rugged area, in 1879. I have a couple of pictures here that I'd like to share. Because this is such a enjoyable topic for me, and because it's in part the work I do, the book that I published last year, I visit a lot of state boundary posts and markers and things, and my wife mercifully generally tends to work on the weekends, so my daughter, who just turned 4, she gets dragged off with Dad to the middle of nowhere to look at some odd little thing in middle of a farm road. So just some examples here. This is my daughter, and she'll show up in the pictures, happily playing along with Dad here. My daughter is looking down at a survey marker embedded in that concrete circle, and that brass plug is where the states of Colorado, Nebraska, and Kansas come together. I'm standing, essentially my right leg is in Colorado, my left leg is in Nebraska, and I'm looking due south. So my daughter's just barely in Colorado. Kansas would be just to her right. And this is it's ranch land area, obviously, with the dirt track you can see off in the distance. I've always been impressed that the Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska monument is a gated community. It's that only certain people are allowed in there, but nobody asked for my paperwork. I was able to sneak in. This one is of me, where Colorado, Nebraska, and Wyoming come together. In fact, this picture I used in my book, and I think it's on the website for MSU Denver's history department, so that you can see what we look like. And so there's this fancy monument with the states' names carved in at the bottom, and the monument itself is not on private property, but to get there you have to meander through literally a cattle herd. Every time I've driven out there, there's a group of cows standing at a drinking trough right next to the monument, looking at me like, oh Lord, here's another tourist. We get 3 every year, and so it's usually the same guy. So again, Colorado to the south, the corner of Nebraska, and then the corner of Wyoming back behind me. My daughter, again, scaling the fence. This is from about 2 years ago. She is at the northeastern corner of the state. So if I was being less politically correct, I'd call it Nebraska's armpit, but we're certainly not going to call it that. Just that corner where Colorado sticks into the state of Nebraska. And where she is, she's in the Colorado portion of it. The monument, that stone piece that's been nicely eroded and chipped away in the middle, that's the northeastern corner of the state. And then there's historical markers on the ground, 3 of them in Nebraska, one on the left, one in the back, one on the right, honoring the different counties of Nebraska that meet there. And then the one closest to my daughter, that's closest to the camera, is a historical marker from the State Historical Society, and then talking about the surveys of that boundary there. Also a gated community, a much harder one to get into because the gate doesn't actually open, so you have to scale the fence and risk horrible, horrible personal injury in trying to get over that thing, but certainly worth a visit all the same. This is only about 2 miles south of Interstate 80, just outside of Julesburg, so probably the easiest of the monuments to visit. Here is the marker where Colorado, New Mexico, and Oklahoma come together. I visited at dusk out by Black Mesa, and I'm standing in Colorado. If you see the fence line on the right-hand side that runs off into the distance, that fence follows Colorado to the right and New Mexico to the left. And the marker there, Oklahoma, is obviously sort of to the left foreground where the 3 states come together. So my daughter's sort of walking along that invisible line between the Sooner State and the Land of Enchantment. And not too far away is where Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma come together. There's a marker my daughter is standing on, looks like a manhole there. That's actually where the corner is. There's all these dirt farm roads in the area, but they've put some asphalt right at the site for, again, the 5 people a year who trek out there with their unwilling family members. And there's the brass plug she's standing directly on. Behind her, where that windmill shape thing is, that's the southwestern corner of Kansas. So Colorado would be to the left, and I'm in Oklahoma looking sort of northeast that direction. So Kansas to the background, Colorado to the left. There's no way to get to this spot from Colorado. There's a little piece of the Cimarron River that cuts right through the southeastern corner of the state, and there's no roads or bridges across it, so you have to travel into one of our neighbors to go visit the southeastern corner of the state of Colorado. And we come back to Four Corners. I couldn't find my picture of me there. I haven't been there since I was almost my daughter's age from those pictures, doing the usual embarrassing spider crawl on each of the 4 states. And this summer, I'm planning to make it out to the northwestern corner. That's the only one that I haven't visited yet. Again, in large part because it's the most difficult to reach, and well, up until now, I haven't really had a car that could get me on the roads out there. So that's on the agenda for my daughter and I, and even my wife, if she's game, coming up here this summer.
Hey, Derek, can I jump in with a question?
Yes, indeed. I'm wrapping up, so...
I was just curious, given the look of Colorado, the rectangular shape, could you comment on why the territory reflected a desire for some sort of geometric consistency or neatness, as opposed to reflecting any natural or cultural boundaries or divisions that might have been noted in Colorado?
Certainly. And this is a big debate when all state boundaries in the West were created. Do we use geography or do we use geometry? What methods are we going to use to divide it up? Let's switch back over to the map here for a second. And let's see my Google here. Here we go. Okay. So back to the map. The the debate of whether to use geography or to use geometry. Should we use mountain ranges? Should we use rivers to divide? Or should we use geometric boundaries? And one of the arguments against using geography was that it wasn't really that well known. I mean, even when the United States bought Louisiana from the French, all we knew was that we bought the land that drained into the Mississippi River from the west. We didn't know where the Continental Divide was. We didn't know how much land there was, what cultures were already out there, American Indian groups or other European colonists. So even by the time Colorado is created as a territory in 1861, there are far fewer answers than questions about what the landscape looks like. So nobody would be really sure which natural features to use. On top of that, when it comes to the United States, we place such a high premium on land ownership, on knowing exactly, whose property is where. If I'm a farmer, I want to know where my back 40 ends and the next guy's begins. Or if I'm a miner, I want to make sure I know exactly where my property starts and the next person stops. And you need that clarity. You need to be able to define absolutely where your authority starts and stops. And so that's one of the big arguments in favor of using geometric divides. Yes, they create places that are geographical abominations, bringing together the plains and the Rockies, the western slope, environments that don't necessarily have anything in common, that require, for example, diversion projects for water because large populations are in places where the water is not. So the creation of Colorado has a lot of consequences, but the basic idea was we want a place that we can define, that we can identify as easily, as clearly, as fundamentally as possible, because the stakes are so high. You need to be able to know exactly where your law and order ends, and Wyoming has to pick it up, or one of the other neighbors.
And another quick question, thinking especially about the southern boundary, and I know you touched on this in your book too, was there any discussion after the Mexican War about extending the boundary of New Mexico further north to include the Hispanic communities of the San Luis Valley, or was that just wishful thinking on behalf of Santa Fe residents?
I'm not so sure about wishful thinking on their part, but certainly wishful thinking on the part of people in the San Luis Valley. The Hispano settlements of Costilla County, Conejos County, and so on were created as part of land grants given by Mexico from settlers moving north up the Rio Grande. And there's no connection culturally, in some cases spiritually, politically, between the Hispano communities of southern Colorado and the Anglos that move into the gold mining areas in the late 1850s. But in their desire to create something that would be effective, that would work for managing this population, the territory is just plunked down with those four invisible lines. They're clear, they're easy to define, but they also mean that about 3,000 people of Hispano ancestry are now assigned to a territory that they don't necessarily have anything in common with. They're cut off from New Mexico and attached to Colorado. And there have been, even in the 1860s, there were arguments about giving some of that land, perhaps even all, up to the 38th parallel, one line of latitude to the north, where New Mexico's line used to be, giving that back to New Mexico to create this unified culture. And the reason that never happened was a pretty silly one. It was that we have this rectangle and it's this nice, neat shape. We don't need to goof it up. We don't need to modify it. But there were complaints from New Mexico about this loss of sort of cultural cousins, people who have more in common with Santa Fe and Albuquerque than they do with Denver and Boulder and Fort Collins. So the argument is waged for a long time. One of the big problems was political participation, because the first legislature for Colorado Territory that met in Denver in the fall of 1861, it had several Hispano members who, it's almost as if, whoever drew the short straw in San Luis that day had to go up to Denver, because you don't want to, you don't really feel like you're a part of this group, but there's an invisible line now that says you are. And the Hispano members that came to Denver for that legislature, first off, they arrived late. They showed up after the session had been going on for a couple days because it took so long to get to Denver from there. They had to travel farther than anybody else. And they sit in silence in the back of the room for quite a while until some of the legislators realize that they have no idea what's going on. They don't speak the language that the legislature is conducting its business. And so there was a debate as to whether or not the legislature should pay for translators for these Hispano members, not necessarily because they didn't want the Southern Colorado members to participate, mostly because they didn't want to spend the money. And ultimately they said, since we're a territory, since the federal government's still officially in charge, we'll send the federal government the bill for translators. We won't pay it ourselves. So there will be some major ethnic consequences to the creation of this boundary, things that Colorado still battles with today. There's still tensions within the state, ethnically, geographically. We want to talk about water law. There's always fights over, does water stay on the western slope? Does it get pumped to the eastern slope? The boundaries have a great deal of consequences. They're not just four pleasant, delightful, invisible lines. They have some major impact to this day.
Mm-hmm. We have a question that's come in about now the northern boundary, and I know you've commented recently even in the media about this, but your comments on the recent efforts in Weld County to create a new state.
Ah, yes. The idea of secession is nothing new, not only in Colorado but throughout the American West, and it draws from this tension that you've plunked down these boundaries, and this was something that advocates of secession in Weld County said 2 years ago. I'm actually delivering a paper on the secession movement on Saturday, so good timing here. There was this sense that boundaries that were drawn 150 years ago don't necessarily reflect current needs, current desires, and so the talk of seceding, not just within Colorado, but across the country is common. California has had somewhere around 200 distinct secession movements within it to subdivide or split or however you want to go through the state. Colorado's secession movements, briefly, the very first one was actually in southern Colorado in 1877. The state was only 1 year old, and silver miners in the San Juan Mountains, Del Norte, Ouray, Silverton, Durango, that area, they felt that they were cut off from Denver. There was no railroads. They didn't feel like they had any political influence, and so they talked about seceding to create the state of San Juan, and they were going to take some of northern New Mexico with them. It eventually fell apart because Pueblo tried to hijack the secession movement, because Pueblo wanted to be state capital, and they couldn't defeat Denver on it, so they thought they'd try to make their own, sort of take this state movement, secession movement, and it just sort of fell apart. Very quickly they got railroads and better transportation, communication, and so on. There have been a number of discussions of secession along the Continental Divide, in part because of practicality. It's just not that easy to manage a state with this incredible natural feature within it. The first governor of Colorado Territory, William Gilpin, for whom Gilpin County is named, Gilpin was a big fan of Colorado, the shape that it is right now, using the mountains as a unifying force rather than a dividing force. He saw the Rockies as this central focus for the state, which the ski areas, I think, would agree with him on that one too. But plenty of other people have said it's ridiculous. There's two distinct population centers. You've got the Denver-dominated eastern slope. You've got Grand Junction dominating the western slope. They don't need that line in, or they don't need to be lumped together into one. It's just not a practical thing. None of the secession movements have worked, in part because of the complications that are inherent in secession. If it's going to happen, it has to be approved by the state that's affected. So Colorado's legislature, the governor, would have to approve it. There'd have to be a vote of the statewide voters, because the boundaries of Colorado are within the state constitution. So the constitution would have to be amended to change the boundaries. And if the governor, the legislature, and the voters said yes, then it went to Washington, D.C., and Congress has to decide whether they want a new state. The president would have to sign on the creation of a new state, and the odds of all of that happening are not particularly good. The secession movement in 2013 that was based out of Weld County, it ultimately included 11 counties that voted in November of 2013 as to whether we should stick around or whether there is a better place, a better idea for us to be our own state, maybe to join Wyoming or to join Kansas, maybe to bring in some counties from Kansas or Nebraska that aren't happy with their state. And the vote that was held in November of 13 had 5 of the 11 counties voting yes, but Weld County, the one that advocated for secession, Weld County voters rejected it. So the county that was pushing for it decided not to pursue the idea, and it sort of fell apart. But the secession movements that boil up in Colorado every once in a while, or Kansas or California or Wyoming or wherever, they reflect this idea that the boundaries that were created don't necessarily meet the needs of current communities. But people in southern Colorado would have said the same thing in 1861, 5 minutes after the boundary of Colorado was created. They didn't like that line either. Once a boundary has been set, it's almost impossible to change. Let's put it this way. The reason that very few of these none of these secession movements have gone anywhere, is that Congress is not about to start the precedent. If they say, okay, well, this portion of Colorado can become its own state or is going to break away here, we would never stop the division, the subdivision. Let's put it this way, when the vote in 2013 took place, there was a lot of anger within Weld County because Greeley voters overwhelmingly rejected it. It was split almost 50-50 outside of Greeley in the county, so there was talk about, okay, well, then maybe Weld County can secede, but Greeley can stay with Colorado if they like Colorado so much. Or there was also a proposal that instead of Weld and Sedgwick and Phillips and some of the other counties leaving, that they would stay and we'd just vote Denver and Boulder out of the state, and they can be their own liberal bastion in contrast with a more conservative state. And none of these are going to happen.
It sounds like, yeah, the likelihood of any kind of San Luis Valley secession is similar. There was a question about that, given, again, the sense of isolation and separate Hispanic traditions there. But,
yeah, there's a lot of sensible arguments, and there's both short-term and long-term things that fuel these debates. There were a lot of factors that made people frustrated in 2013 in northeastern Colorado, but it's the precedent that the federal government is never going to start, because then it would never ever stop. The division and subdivision would obsess the country.
Right. Well, just one more quick question about the earlier days when the boundaries may have been slightly more fluid. I've always been a big fan of John Wesley Powell. It's hard not to admire a one-armed river raptor like that.
I can't do it with two.
It's hard to do with two. He, as you know, of course, produced that report suggesting a lot of geographically sensible ideas for settling the West in 1878.
He did.
It does seem that if Congress had allowed northern New Mexico to extend to the 38th parallel, that would have allowed the Rio Grande Valley, the San Luis Valley, to remain connected to the southern portion. Was there any possibility if his report had come out a few years earlier that would have made any difference?
I don't think so. I'm actually pulling up the map right now. that you're talking about. Powell is one-armed Civil War veteran who came to the West. Where did my map go? Okay, I think it's here. He came to the West in. Am I on the screen share right now? Was that?
We see you.
Okay, you see me. So let's pull up.
In your book, you've got a copy of it.
Okay, actually, I'm pulling it up right here. I just need to shrink it down so people can see it. Fit page. Where's this? Oh, the heck with it. Let's just zoom it down a little bit. Okay, that'll work. Okay, can you see the map?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was the map that Powell puts together as a suggestion for the way Western states should look. And he argued that because the West is such a dry place and water is going to be so contentious, states should be drawn to have their boundaries fit with major river drainages. And so if we look at Colorado itself, let's see if we can zoom up a little bit here to our own neck of the woods. If we look there at Colorado, there would be several independent pieces. You've got the light brown of the South Platte River to the north that goes up connecting with the North Platte in Wyoming and Nebraska. There's the Arkansas Valley in blue. There's the red of the Republican River on the far right-hand side. There's the red of the Green River on the left-hand side. The dark brown is the Colorado River and the Gunnison River drainage. The purple down in the southwest corner, that's all sort of the lower Colorado, the San Juan River, and then the green would be the Rio Grande. And you can see the numbers on the side of the map over here. I don't know if my cursor shows up, but right about there is where the 38th parallel would have been. So the Rio Grande would have been would have entirely been part of New Mexico territory. But if we use the 38th parallel, that's also going to include a portion of the Arkansas. So part of it would have been in Colorado to the north, then New Mexico, then Colorado again, then Kansas. The idea was a sound one. I mean, it certainly makes sense that you'd want these essential resources to be contained within one place. Would we have the arguments about diversion under the Continental Divide? Nobody really knows. But by the time he makes this proposal, the West's boundaries have essentially been set. From 1868 is really the last year of a big change in the West. That's when what was then this odd little appendage to Dakota became separate as Wyoming territory. That what's now North and South Dakota and Wyoming were all this one odd-shaped unit, and Wyoming's just cut off in 68. Eventually North and South Dakota are split too. But for all intents and purposes, the map that we recognize in the West has looked that way since 1868. So once these boundaries have been declared, it's very difficult to change them, because whether it takes literally an act of Congress or people in the West are starting to organize their institutions, their political and legal systems, once you start that, it's difficult to change. And so it's a fascinating idea, and it's an interesting map to take a look at, but very doubtful that such a proposal would ever really have come to pass.
Yeah. Well, we just have thank you. It's a great illustration of how the West might have looked. It's very fun to compare. We just have a couple of minutes, and the questions come in asking whether you're familiar with Harvey production film, The 5 States of Colorado.
I am. I've actually worked with Harvey Productions on a documentary about the state capitol building, and they do beautiful work. And the idea of the different units of the pieces that create the state of Colorado, whether it's ethnic divisions, geographic divisions, there's that great film on it. There's a book also that might be of interest and would be useful perhaps in putting together a school curriculum looking at the different pieces of the state. There's a book called by William Wyckoff, W-Y-C-K-O-F-F. William Wyckoff, and it's called Creating Colorado, and it's probably about 10 or 15 years old by now, but it follows the same general structure as the Havey film of the different geographic, different cultural pieces that make up the state. And if you're thinking about a curriculum to put together, that might help in, how do we look at what makes southern Colorado different from the metro area, from the western slope, and so on.
Thank you. Yeah, those are great resources. Absolutely. I think
Great.
I think we're toward the end of our time. Is that right, Taylor?
Yeah, it looks like we're right at about 45 minutes, which is just about perfect. I went ahead and threw that link to that book actually up in the showcase, so
Thank you.
people will be able to get access to that.
I think we should include the Powell map too, actually, the John Wesley Powell map as well. That would be great.
Yeah, I'll continue to add a few things as we finish up here too. So those resources will be there with the archive of this. Yeah, well, thank you. I want to thank obviously both of you for your time, as well as anyone in the audience that was listening, and those that watch it after the fact. Again, this is 2 of a series, and actually we're looking at possibly even more than the 5 scheduled now. So keep an eye out for future hangouts coming in this series. Todd's actually will be next on April 16th at 4 p.m. I think I'm right about that. Is that right, Todd? Looking at 20th century Colorado at war. So that has obviously some really direct ties to the USS Colorado and the Navy submarine. So excited about follow-up events. And again, teacher workshop as well coming July 28th to History Colorado. So that'll be sort of a culminating event. And the 29th, there'll actually be a reception as well that night. So lots coming up around this topic. And again, thank you both for joining. Derek, thanks for your knowledge.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I love learning with these along with everyone else. So we're signing off. Thanks again, and we'll look forward to the next hangout coming April 16th.